Welcome everyone, my name is Chandra and I work at the Penticton Museum, and I'm happy to welcome you to our Brown Bag Lectures. And Brown Bag Lectures are a series of speakers who speak on different topics, from community-related topics to environmental and ecological, and also, of course, historical. And I have the pleasure of introducing to you today Don Gayton. And Don is a retired, I want to say biologist, agronomist, ecologist, and but it's also a writer. And so he's presented for us a number of times, and one was related to forests and forest fires and the history of those, and also some of his own writings. Today, he's going to be speaking about Vietnam War resistors, and I imagine it's from personal experience. So, without further ado, I bring Don.
Did I push the right button?
Yeah.
I guess so. Well, thank you, Chandra. It's a pleasure to be here, and I can't see a thing, but I know you're out there. So what I'm going to talk about is part political history, but also part personal history. As a kid, I grew up in Southern California in a classic nuclear family in a classic California suburb. In fact, I was there for the birth of suburbs, the birth of car commuting, of freeways and strip malls and car dealerships and fast food joints. It was a classic 1950s Americana of high tide and green grass. My dad handed me a football when I was about 5 years old, and I played that sport right up through my high school years in Seattle, Washington. Religion was all around me, but by accident or by design. My folks never pushed it on me, and by the age of 17, I was pretty much decided that I wasn't interested. When I turned 18 in 1964, I followed the law and went down to the Seattle courthouse to register for the military draft. But I did so with grave doubts. The Vietnam War was beginning to heat up, and America was about to get involved. For the next 2 years, I was safely ensconced in the university with the treasured 2S, the student draft deferment. Then in 1966, I joined the United States Peace Corps and spent the next 2 years, undraftable, also 2S, working with peasant farmers in Colombia. I came back to the United States in late 1968 and immediately went down to that same Seattle courthouse and filed for conscientious objector status, or CO status, which it was commonly referred to, was almost exclusively granted on religious grounds, of which I had none. So I made my claim based on morality alone. I could not countenance a government who would send me, in one instance, to help peasant farmers in one country, and then send me to kill them in another. I went back to finish university, but my 4 years of draft deferment had run out. I received the induction notice telling me to report to the Fairchild Air Force Base near Spokane. I went through the physical and then handed the sergeant a copy of my claim as a conscientious objector, a 2-page document that I wrestled and sweated blood over. I could not be inducted into the military until my conscientious objector application was settled, and I spent anguished months presenting my case to the appeals committee of the local draft board, and then the regional draft board, and then the national board. and in every case, my appeal was denied. In the meantime, the draft lottery came into force based on your birth date, and I got a very high number. Looking back on this, I have to assume that since I had already been drafted, my lottery number was actually irrelevant. But perhaps some army bureaucrat looked at my file and decided I would make a lousy soldier and threw it in the round file. I guess I'll never know. At any rate, Judy and I, she's here in the audience with me, we got married, we moved to Okanagan County, and I started working on cattle ranches. By this time, though, we were both totally fed up with American politics, and we applied for landed immigrant status in Canada. That process took an inordinately long time, but finally the two of us, plus 2 infant sons, packed our few belongings, and in the fall of 1974, proceeded to Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. Saskatoon was where one of my close comrades from the Peace Corps had already located to, and he had offered to help us get settled. So here we are now, 2 proud Canadians with 5 children and 4 grandchildren. So that is just one story of about 80,000 other stories, since that is the estimate of how many Americans came to Canada as a result of the Vietnam War. And my story is pretty mundane compared to some. For instance, the young man who was drafted, joined the military, and landed a desk job. He was processing papers and saw an order sending his detachment to fight in Vietnam. That night, he deserted the military and crossed the border into Canada in the trunk of a friend's car. So one of the common terms that you hear is draft dodging. And that is accurate in a certain way, since many came either because they had gotten a draft notice or were about to get one, or like in the above instance, were already in the military and deserted. But the dodger term minimizes the huge emotional turmoil, the life-changing decisions, and the family traumas that these young men went through. So the term Vietnam War resistor is a better descriptor. My own family experience gives a taste of what many others went through. Our grandfather was a drill sergeant during World War I. My father never served in the military, but he worked at Boeing Airplanes building B-25 bombers during World War II. Both were staunch, gun-owning, red-blooded Republicans. My relationship with my father was broken by Vietnam and was never fully repaired. One of the fundamental difficulties my American generation faced was this. Our parents had endured the trauma of World War II, and if there is such a thing as a just war, that was it. Our father's generation came together, they sacrificed tremendously, and they won. And then, a mere 20 years later, along comes one of the more unjust wars in modern history. To most of our parents, the notion of opposing the US government and of flouting military commands was unthinkable. Another untold story of this era is the number of young women who came to Canada as a result of the Vietnam War. Many came as wives or partners of war resistors, but not all. Some came on their own accord, fed up not only with the war, but with racism and other negative aspects of American life. So, no, that didn't sound too bad. I was afraid you're going to hear all the gulping. Now I'm going to switch to a few slides that I have, and I presume, Chandra, this is the
Yes.
gizmo, and do I point it there or there?
Not me.
Okay, let's see what happens. Wow, all right. So like I say, I was a classic American kid growing up in the 50s. I'd like to point out that that car in the background is from an antique car show. It wasn't a contemporary. It doesn't date me at all. So. And that was my grandfather. Like I said, he was a drill sergeant, trained soldiers in World War II and World War I. I'm going to stand where I can see them here. And there's the three of us. Whenever the three were together, we always vied to see who could stand on the highest part to show that we were taller than the others. And then I was sent to a very remote part of rural Colombia, I think because I was a bit of a shit disturber, and they wanted me as far away from the other volunteers as possible. And I was in Chocó, which is right on the border with Panama, and it was a fascinating experience. I learned a lot more from the Colombians than I ever taught them, but it was a very life-changing experience. So here's kind of a timeline, 64 to 73, where was that period. Excuse me. It kind of ramped up very quickly, actually. And just last night there was this piece about Selma, the movie Selma. Quite a powerful movie, showing at that period of time Martin Luther King marching to Montgomery from Selma. Really the watershed moment in the civil rights period in the United States. But it was also accompanied with a lot of violence. And then the My Lai incident, a firebombing of a village that got a huge amount of coverage, and I think was a bit of a turning point in certain people's attitudes about the war. And then 68, Martin Luther King was assassinated. And then 1970, in the midst of an anti-war demonstration at a small university in Ohio, 4 students were killed by the National Guard. And then in 73, the politicians finally realized that this was not going anywhere and pulled out. So just a few news clips of that era. And then here's the well, I didn't want to do that. So you can see how the number of young men of my age, oh sorry, I'm standing.
No, you're good.
Okay. Who were drafted, and it ramped up tremendously through the 60s into 1970, slowed down, and then finally ended in 1973. 1969 was when they issued that lottery number, and if you got a high number, then your chances of being drafted were less. And then in '77, Jimmy Carter issued a pardon to certain categories of draft dodgers. Turning to British Columbia, there was a lot of support. You know, the two communities in Canada that seemed to be a focus for the draft dodger movement were Toronto and Vancouver. Toronto was probably the hot spot, you know, close to large centers of population in the U.S. I'm following, you know, I'm primarily interested in what happened here in BC, but there was a lot of activity in Vancouver during that time period. That was a massive sit-in at the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. That's the headquarters of the U.S. military. And then Kent State, again, I think along with My Lai, was probably a major turning point in a lot of people's attitudes about the war. And then here's the, I wasn't aware of this one, where 500 young Canadians invaded Blaine. And I think this is a satirical thing where they mocked it up to make it look like Nixon was holding this sign. And then a very interesting event happened in 2006. We were living in Nelson at the time, and I was able to participate in some of this conference, and it actually brought together, sponsored by the Doukhobors community, you know, a pacifist community in the Castlegar area. They brought together draft dodgers, other pacifists, and military veterans. So it was a very meaningful and profound experience for a lot of people. And this statue was developed as to commemorate it, you know, of Canadians welcoming American draft dodgers. And there was a big fight going on. They wanted to put it in, make it in a public place in Nelson, and the mayor of Nelson said no way. And then Castlegar said, well, maybe we'll take it, and that didn't work out either. And so I guess it's in some private home right now. But I think both communities were afraid of, gee, we're going to scare off American tourists or something by having this. Anyway, one of the more memorable moments in that conference was a young woman who, again, had come to Canada not as a partner of a draft dodger, but just of her own accord. And her family disowned her. And then she got word that her father was in the hospital and he was mortally ill. She went back to Wisconsin to the hospital, walked in the door of the hospital room, and her father said, never darken my door again. And he died the next day. So that's, you know, that gives you a sense of some of the emotional trauma involved in these decisions of these young people, leaving not only their family, their country, and friends and family ties. There is a link there to some more information about that conference. I've been kind of interested in tracking where the war resistors wound up in BC, and these are some of the communities that, and I'm sure you folks may know of others that you can add to this list, but there was something about Nelson and the Spokane Valley that really attracted them. I think it was, part of the draft dodger, the war resistor movement was also a back to the land movement. And so there was inexpensive land and houses and so on in places like Nelson and Caslow and then Johnson's Landing on Kootenai Lake is a very small community, but it had been a Quaker. There was a group of Quakers that moved from Southern California to Johnson's Landing in the 1950s as kind of a back to the land. We've had enough of Southern California, we're going to Johnson's Landing. And so I think that was also a corridor that they had, people stayed in touch, and so people came to Johnson's Landing, various places, and a lot of it was word of mouth and so on. This was the 60s, of course, and so some people started communes and various groupings of interesting groupings. And certainly the Gulf Islands was a mecca for a lot of war resistors. So, yeah, and here's another, I noticed that whoever put this together can't spell Canada, but it is a great compendium if you want to dive into this of material related to Vietnam War resistors. So that's all for the PowerPoint, and now what I have are through friends and friends of friends and colleagues and so on, I've collected a few of these stories about individual draft dodgers. So I'd like to, at some point it would be, I hope to see this published, but in the meantime, I just have some excerpts to read. So I'll bet the name Corky Evans rings a bell. One of my favorite, not only as a politician, but as a friend. He was great for, he started off giving a talk with notes, and then about 3 or 4 minutes into the talk, he'd throw the notes away and just extemporize. Great public speaker. Anyway, so this is Corky Evans in somewhere outside of Los Angeles, I believe, as an 18-year-old. I was called for a physical by the draft. I went to the Induction Center and I passed all the tests. They sent us with a sergeant to mind us to lunch at a diner across the street. I climbed out of a window in the men's room and ran. Later, during a demonstration at the Induction Center, I was witness to an assault on a police officer. Hundreds of police were there when dawn broke and they charged the people. Andy, that's his brother, half-brother. Andy and I had spent the night in a church with a group of people who thought they were pacifists. Maybe I did too. Then we went and sat with a group of people who wanted to block the building and remain nonviolent. When the police charged, they broke heads with clubs and they moved through that group sitting in front of the building. I moved and then helped people turn over cars to make a barricade. And the demonstration turned into a riot. Maybe an hour later, I was at an intersection with a crowd of people when the highway patrol cops stopped and charged the demonstrators. I didn't have time to escape the area, so I stepped behind a pillar behind a store, or outside the store. As the cops went and passed me, a black woman in a hospital worker's uniform walked beside the pillar and out onto the street. She looked to me like she was on her way home after a graveyard shift at the hospital. Her arms were full of grocery bags, and she couldn't see over them to realize what she was walking into. Maybe 40 cops were charging across the intersection. All the demonstrators had run, so there was nobody for them to confront as they moved through the crossing. Until they got to the pillar I was hiding behind. At exactly that moment, the woman with the grocery bag stepped out onto the sidewalk in front of the cops. They clubbed her against the plate glass window that she was passing. Her bags ripped open and fell forward with oranges and milk bottles spilling out onto the sidewalk. When she hit the ground, they picked her up so they could club her again. This time, she went over to a city garbage can that toppled and spilled its waste. A heavy steel conical lid came off the garbage can and bounced on the pavement as the cops went passing, still clubbing the woman. I was that white kid raised in safety and ignorance. I was drawn forward in the wake of this outrage, but I had no response. As I watched in horror, a young black man about my age ran past me, grabbed that garbage can lid, and spun like a discus thrower and threw it at the cop, who was now beating the woman in front of him. The guy who threw the thing just kept spinning as he let go and kept on running back around the corner that he had come from. The lid hit the cop at the base of his helmet. I know it hit the helmet from the sound of the clash that I can still hear. The cop went down. The 39 other cops turned and saw me. The Induction Center where this happened was on the edge of a black community in West Oakland. I spun around and ran. I was young and fast and not weighted down with flak jackets and clubs and helmets. I outran the cops and I kept going until I crossed into the white and wealthier part of Oakland. When I slowed down, I understood what privilege was. I think for the first time in my life. So that was Corky Evans, and it goes on, it's a riveting, I keep telling him he needs to write his memoirs, and so far he hasn't. He sends me little bits and pieces every now and then. Here's another short passage. Daniel Wood, does that name ring a bell? Quite a good writer. Yeah, if I'm not mistaken, he just recently passed away. In October of 1969, I was called to an immigration office in Kamloops, BC, to take a federal test to confirm my status as a landed immigrant in Canada. The official had a file on me. He also had prepared a Q&A scorecard that covers things like my education level, my French, my economic prospects, my marital status, etc., etc. And I knew from advanced advice what roughly was coming and what I had to say in order to pass the test. I knew as well that if I failed the test, then I'd be deported back into the arms of the FBI for my draft evasion and my subsequent evasion after my arrest of a trial. I faced 3 years in prison were that to happen. So the immigration officer, had just started asking his questions when he interrupted himself and asked me, "Why do you want to live in Canada?" I knew that was not part of the test. And for a second or so, I asked myself, should I answer him honestly? Was he an official who would consider my not joining the war in Vietnam as a sign of hippie rebelliousness? A lack of integrity or patriotism? Would I fail the test for admitting this? He probably saw the pause. I figured I was doomed. And nevertheless, I said, I'm against the war in Vietnam. Simple as that. He looked me in the eyes, closed his folder, and ended the test before it hardly started. Welcome to Canada, he said. And that moment will always stay with me. Sorry, I get a little bit emotional about some of this stuff. So, another story. This was a comrade of mine in the Peace Corps. He was from Virginia originally. My draft board in Arlington, Virginia tried to draft me out of the Peace Corps twice. I appealed and attempted to register as a conscientious objector, but the board rejected my argument, and then I was successfully appealed my second induction notice, and I was able to finish my Peace Corps service. Shortly after I returned home to Virginia in late 1968, I received the expected notice to report for induction. My fellow draftees and I were bused to an induction facility where we were given physicals. It was always my intention to refuse induction, and I attempted to convince others to join me, mostly younger guys, but they weren't receptive. They didn't seem very aware. Some of those that I spoke with didn't even know that they were headed for Vietnam or even where it was. After passing the physical, we were assembled in a room with an American flag at the front and instructed to take one step forward to acknowledge our induction into the U.S. Army. I didn't, and I was given a second chance by myself after the others were herded out to be sheared. I refused again. So I assumed that there would be a warrant for my arrest, and I decided to leave the country. Hastily hitched rides up the coast to the Canadian border, now on to Vancouver. I crashed at a co-op house of Simon Fraser University students for a month. And later, a co-op member's parents kindly drove me down to the border to apply for landed immigrant status, which I was granted after a cursory interview, despite my awful French, my lack of a university degree, or any marketable skills. So that's another story. And Bob Nicholson, some of you may know him from Penticton here. I do also remember the intense intergenerational conflict that Don experienced. The World War II generation was completely taken by the mantra of my country, right or wrong. So yes, the political divide was wide back then, and the status quo side vigorously defending its turf. The difference was the lack of social media back then. Everything played out on 3 major TV channels, each with their own biases. Anyway, I think I'm going to leave it at that and hopefully open it up for questions. And again, have the lights maybe. This estimate of 80,000 draft dodgers or war resistors that came to Canada, I've seen estimates as low as 40,000 and as high as 250,000. But there's a whole series of confusing issues, like other people would be immigrating to Canada not because of the Vietnam War, so, and you couldn't really separate that. And a lot of people came in various modes and methods, some as landed immigrants, some as just back to the landers and so on. And again, the female component, we don't really know how many of those were coming because of the war. We just have made these assumptions. And it is interesting that because these people were by definition kind of social activists and politically aware, they tended to kind of meld into with their complementary people in places like Vancouver and Nelson and Toronto and God knows, the Gulf Islands. So I think one of the net impacts of that war resistor generation is that it kind of enhanced social movements in Canada that were already there, but were enhanced by these young folks that came. So anyway, I'm happy to hear comments or answer questions, and I appreciate your attention. So does anybody know a draft house? Yes. Go ahead.
You don't mention anything about the dope growing.
Okay, since you brought it up.
If you don't mind, can you repeat any questions that you...
Sure. I neglected to mention the dope growing. I've actually written about that in this book that I just published, how BC Bud became world famous largely because of draft dodgers in the Slocan Valley and Nelson and places like that. In Vancouver, they learned, all of the botanical ins and outs, and they were intercrossing, and they learned about feminizing plants and the whole 9 yards. So BC Bud actually owes a lot to the war resistor movement. So, but I never inhaled, so. There was another question. Yes.
Yeah, actually, my husband, he didn't know, but he asked me to ask, how many of the war resistors that came to Canada actually ended up going back to America, and what were the ramifications for them if they did?
What about the war resistors that came to Canada and then went back to the States? Buck, one of the fellows that I wrote from Virginia, he did that. He never faced any jail time, but his father was lieutenant colonel, I think. So that certainly helped his case. Jimmy Carter's pardon in 1977 had some impact. But there, again, we have no statistics, but people did spend jail time for flouting the draft or deserting the military. It was refusing the draft was serious, but deserting, if you've ever already been in the military and deserted, that's a much more severe consequences. So, yes.
Where does Dien Bien Phu fit in your story?
Where does Dien Bien Phu fit in my story? I probably knew that at one time, but I've forgotten.
Because it was before your involvement, wasn't it? It was
64, yeah. So who knows about Dien Bien Phu? Because I
know a little.
Okay.
I know the French, Indochina was an old French colony.
Yeah.
And then after the Second World War, Vietnamese nationalist organizations came together to expel the French. The French decided to fight, and the biggest battle took place at Dien Bien Phu. I think it was 1956.
Okay.
And they were defeated. The French were defeated, and that was sort of the end of things. And what happened there, I'm not too sure.
Yeah,
The division of Vietnam into North and South, I don't know. But it was a French.
Right,
French
yeah. Sorry?
couldn't hear a word about it.
Oh, so the French, Vietnam, or the former, it was Indochina that was colonized by the French, and the Vietnamese rebelled, and finally Dien Bien Phu was when they finally kicked the French out, and I think that was 1954. Is that right?
Yeah, somewhere.
Yeah. So there was a vacuum of a decade or so, and lots of back and forth, I think, and then that's when the Americans decided that, well, maybe we can colonize Vietnam. I know, that's being sarcastic, but the other thing that really bothers me, and when I look back on that whole trauma and the 80,000 to 81,000 people, men of my generation, who died in Vietnam, plus all the untold numbers of PTSD and injuries and family disruptions and so on, that the Vietnam War was all about China. It was like, oh my God, China's going to take over Laos and Indochina and Vietnam and so on. And then the Americans got in bed with the Chinese economically. China owns half of the American economy now, I think, or more. So that part really galls me, to think that I lost so many of my contemporaries for a totally false premise. Other comments? Well, again, thank you for your attention, and there's a lot more there, many more stories, some of them fascinating, some of them tragic, some of them funny, but that's a book that's yet to be written. So thanks again.